America's most important vehicle might also be its most dangerous weakness. Not the F-35, not the B-21, not even the aircraft carrier. The aircraft holding much of American air power together is the tanker, and that would be easier to ignore if this was just an old support platform quietly doing its job in the background. It is not. The United States is heading deeper into a Pacific theater where distance is brutal, bases are exposed, and the aircraft that make American reach possible are becoming more important at exactly the moment they are becoming harder to protect. So this story is not really about whether America has powerful aircraft. It does. The real question is whether those aircraft can get to the fight, stay there long enough to matter, and make it back once the fuel system behind them starts coming under pressure. That sounds like a support problem. It is not. In the Pacific, fuel is part of the battle, and that is where this gets dangerous. American air power depends on aircraft that do not drop bombs, do not win dogfights, and almost never get remembered. They extend range. They create persistence. They turn distant bases into real launch points. That is what makes them so important. It is also what makes them so vulnerable, because much of this system still rests on an aging tanker fleet, a replacement program with real technical trouble, and a theater where China does not need to destroy every American fighter to weaken American air power. It just has to make the refueling chain harder to use, riskier to protect, and slower to keep alive. If that is true, then the aircraft America depends on most may also be the one it can least afford to lose. Here is the part that usually gets skipped. When people picture American air power, they picture the sharp end of it. Fighters, bombers, carrier aircraft, maybe surveillance platforms if they follow this world closely. What they usually do not picture is the aircraft that decides whether all those machines can actually operate at useful distance. That is the tanker. And on paper, that sounds almost too simple. It is just fuel in the sky, a support asset, a flying gas station. That is the surface level version. The real version is much more important than that. A tanker does not just add range. It changes what an aircraft is. It can turn a fighter from a short-legged platform into something that can cross huge distances, stay on station, wait for a target, escort another aircraft, or recover somewhere safer instead of rushing home because the tanks are running dry. That matters in any war. In the Pacific, it matters even more, because distance does not just stretch the battlefield. It distorts everything. It affects where aircraft can launch, how long they can remain useful, how much time they spend traveling instead of fighting, and how many sorties the United States can actually generate once the map starts working against it. That is why this cannot be reduced to a support story. Without tankers, a lot of American air power shrinks. Not symbolically, physically, operationally. The aircraft still exist. The pilots still exist. The weapons still exist. But their usable reach starts collapsing back toward the runway. And that creates a problem most people do not see at first. The tanker is valuable precisely because it multiplies other aircraft. One tanker can help several aircraft in a mission cycle. It can keep a strike package moving. It can extend a patrol. It can let a safer, more distant base still matter. That really is a strength. But it also means a tanker is not just another aircraft in the formation. It is a node, a hinge, a piece of the system that many other pieces quietly depend on. And the more important the tanker becomes, the more dangerous it is for the whole air campaign to depend on it. Now comes the uncomfortable part. The United States already knows this aircraft matters. The problem is that the backbone of the system is far older than most people realize. The KC-135 entered service in the 1950s. The first production aircraft arrived in the late 1950s. The last one was delivered in the mid-1960s. So when people talk about American air power in the Pacific, they are partly talking about a refueling backbone built for a completely different military era. That would be easy to laugh off as just another old airplane story. It is not. The KC-135 stayed central because it kept doing a job that proved much harder to replace than it looked. That is the warning hidden inside its age. Not that America let a useless platform linger, but that one of the most important jobs in the entire force stayed tied to a design from a different model of war. And the problem is not simply age. Plenty of military platforms stay in service for a long time. The problem is that the mission around the tanker changed faster than the tanker force changed with it. These aircraft were built before stealth fighters became central, before long-range precision strike networks shaped the battlefield, before China's missile force matured into the threat it is now, and before the Indo-Pacific became the defining theater for U.S. planners. So yes, the tanker still works. But the world it has to work in has become much harder. That should have made the replacement story simple. It did not. On paper, the next chapter should have been reassuring. The Air Force had a replacement. The KC-46 was supposed to begin the handoff. Newer airframe, more modern systems, more capability. A tanker built not just to move fuel, but to move cargo, passengers, medical evacuation loads, and data through the same aircraft. That sounds like exactly what a modern force would want. And to be fair, part of that is real. The KC-46 is not some fake program that exists only in PowerPoint. It is flying. It has been delivered. It is already part of the force. That is where the problem starts. Because the replacement did not arrive and simply erase the old problem. It arrived with its own set of questions. The biggest one centered on something that, at first glance, sounds almost too technical to matter: the remote vision system. But this is exactly the kind of detail that changes the whole story. The older tanker model relied on a boom operator physically positioned in the rear of the aircraft, controlling the refueling boom with direct visual reference. The KC-46 was supposed to modernize that process. Instead of that older arrangement, the operator would use a camera-fed system and panoramic displays to guide the boom into the receiving aircraft. Again, on paper, the sound incredible. Cleaner, more modern, more flexible. Exactly the kind of upgrade you would expect. That is the idea. But there is a problem. If image quality is off, if glare interferes, if depth perception is distorted, if the operator is not seeing the receiving aircraft the way they need to, then this is not some minor comfort issue inside the cabin. It affects the physical act of refueling in flight. And that means it affects one of the most basic things a tanker exists to do. That is why this part matters so much. The most striking contradiction in the whole program is that one of the features meant to define the tanker as more advanced became one of the reasons the aircraft could not fully close the gap it was built to solve. That is the point where this stops feeling like a normal replacement story. The old aircraft stayed too long. The new aircraft arrived, but with real technical deficiencies still hanging over it. And the official testing story did not quietly disappear either. The program was still dealing with critical upgrades tied to boom and the remote vision system well after the first deliveries. That changes the tone of the whole issue. Now, it is not just a question of replacing age with youth. It is a question of whether the United States managed to modernize its most important support aircraft cleanly enough, fast enough, and at the exact moment the strategic environment was becoming less forgiving. So, this stops being just a procurement problem. If this were happening in a permissive theater, maybe the problems would feel narrower, frustrating, expensive, embarrassing, but manageable. The trouble is that the tanker mission is becoming more important at the same time the operating environment is becoming harsher. So even if the KC-46 becomes fully reliable, even if the upgrades land, even if the platform matures exactly the way the Air Force wants, that still does not answer the bigger question. What kind of war is this tanker actually being asked to support? Because once you ask that, the aircraft itself is no longer the whole story. A tanker problem in Europe would already matter. A tanker problem in the Pacific changes the whole calculation, because the Pacific does not just make missions longer. It changes the logic of air power itself. The spaces involved are enormous. Aircraft burn time, and fuel just getting into position. Then they have to stay useful once they get there. Then they still have to get back out. That alone would make refueling important. But the real pressure comes from what distance does to everything around the mission. It affects where aircraft can safely launch from. It affects how close tankers can get. It affects how long fighters can remain on station instead of just transiting. It affects how much flexibility commanders really have once the operation begins. That is why a fighter's advertised range is not the same thing as useful combat reach. Useful reach depends on where the aircraft starts, how much fuel it burns before it even gets near the target area, whether the tanker orbit is where it needs to be, and whether the return trip is still viable once the mission changes in the air. So the Pacific exposes a difference between having aircraft and having usable air power. That difference is the tanker. A tanker can turn a safer, more distant base into something operationally relevant. But geography pulls on a refueling system from every angle. Tankers have to be in the right place, early enough, safe enough, and still close enough to matter. Because once tankers are pushed farther away, everything behind them starts changing. Fighters burn more fuel reaching the fuel. Time on station shrinks. Sortie efficiency drops. What looked workable on a planning slide starts thinning out in real life. That is why the issue is no longer just whether America has enough tankers or modern enough tankers. The issue is that the Pacific turns fuel into strategy. And once that happens, the next question gets harder. If geography is already squeezing the refueling system, what happens when an adversary starts squeezing it too? Up to this point, The tanker problem can still sound like a hard but manageable planning issue. Old aircraft, a troubled replacement, a huge theater. Serious, yes, but still basically an American logistics headache. It is more than that, because China does not need to defeat American air power one fighter at a time to make that air power weaker in practice. That is the part that matters. A lot of people instinctively imagine a future air war as aircraft against aircraft, stealth against stealth, missiles against missile defense, pilots against pilots. Some of that would matter, obviously, but that is not the only way to thin out American combat power. You can also go after the system around it. The Pentagon's own assessments have been pointing in this direction for years. Chinese missile forces are not only about striking warships or dramatic headline targets. They matter here because they can threaten air bases, logistics sites, port facilities, communications links, and other infrastructure the United States needs to keep a campaign moving. That is a shift. The fight is not only about what America flies. It is about whether the system behind those aircraft can keep functioning once it starts taking pressure. And once you look at the tanker through that lens, the vulnerability becomes much easier to see. A tanker has to launch from somewhere. It needs runway access. It needs fuel storage. It needs maintenance. It needs protected command links. It needs a usable orbit. If any of those things come under pressure, the tanker mission starts becoming harder before the tanker itself is even touched. That is what makes this so important. China does not necessarily have to destroy every American fighter to reduce what those fighters can do. It can make them harder to launch, harder to refuel, harder to recover, harder to send back out again. That sounds indirect. It is. But indirect does not mean minor. In some ways, it is more efficient. One fighter taken out is one fighter taken out. One tanker delayed, pushed back, or lost can affect multiple aircraft in the same mission cycle. The damage spreads outward. Range drops. Time on station shrinks. Sortie generation slows. The whole air campaign starts losing thickness. And this is where a lot of the usual public conversation falls short. People talk about whether the United States still has better aircraft. That is still an important question. But in this case, it is incomplete. Better aircraft do not erase a stress fuel chain. Better aircraft do not solve cratered runways. Better aircraft do not make exposed logistics nodes disappear. So the real issue is not just whether America can win an air battle. It is whether America can keep generating enough usable air power at enough range for long enough while the support system behind that air power is being pressured at the same time. And if that is the real question, then the weakest link is no longer just a tanker. It is the entire refueling architecture behind it. So by this point, the pattern should be clear. America's most important aircraft really may be the tanker. But the deeper problem is that the tanker is only the visible part of something even more important. The real weak link is the fuel architecture behind it. That means the tanker aircraft, yes. But it also means the bases they launch from, the runways they need, the fuel storage they depend on, the maintenance that keeps them turning, the command links guiding the mission, and the wider logistics system holding the whole chain together. And that is why this story matters so much. If one fighter is lost, that is one fighter gone. If the refueling system starts breaking down, the effect spreads across the force. Aircraft launch from farther away. They spend more time getting into position. They stay on station for less time. Fewer sorties become truly useful. The air campaign starts thinning out before the decisive fight people usually imagine has even fully arrived. That is the real danger here. On paper, the United States still has extraordinary air power. That part is true. But air power on paper and usable air power in the Pacific are not the same thing. The Pacific is too large, the distances are too punishing, and the support system behind the aircraft is too exposed for that assumption to hold automatically. So this is a conclusion the tanker story keeps pointing toward. The future of American air power may be shaped less by which side builds the flashiest fighter, and more by which side can keep fuel moving, runways usable, bases functioning, and support aircraft alive once the pressure starts. That is not a glamorous answer. It is probably the correct one. Because a stealth fighter without fuel becomes a much smaller weapon. A bomber without tanker support loses flexibility. A carrier air wing without enough reach becomes easy to contain. And a military that cannot protect the aircraft behind its power eventually starts shrinking its own advantage. That is why China does not have to look at the tanker as just another support aircraft. It can look at it as leverage. And that is really the conclusion here. America's weakest link is not simply one aging airplane or one trouble replacement. It is a system that decides how much of America's air power actually arrives when the war gets hard.